The signal came on the 73rd day after the humans left. It was faint, so faint that it almost went unnoticed among the noise and static of a communication network that was barely functioning anymore. A young Tohari technician named Piri was running a routine scan of the outer frequencies when she caught it. A single pulse, repeating every 30 seconds, coming from beyond the edge of Council space. Piri almost dismissed it. She had been working double shifts for weeks, because half the communication staff had been reassigned to emergency logistics, and she was tired in a way that sleep could not fix. But something about the signal made her stop. It was clean. Perfectly clean. No distortion, no interference, no static. In a galaxy full of messy, degraded signals bouncing off dead relays and damaged satellites, this one was as sharp as a blade. The source was far, much further than anything the Council's remaining sensor network could normally reach. Whoever sent it had used a transmission method that cut through space like light through glass. Piri did not recognize the technology, but she knew who built things like that. She contacted Counselor Vithari immediately. Vithari arrived at the communication center within the hour, looking older than he had 2 months ago. The crisis had taken years from him. His silver-blue skin had gone dull. His movements were slower. He had barely slept since the Branathi blockade had escalated into a shooting conflict 3 days ago. 2 Tohari ships had been destroyed. 11 crew members were dead. The Council was on the edge of its first full-scale internal war in 400 years. "Show me," Vithari said. Piri played the signal. A burst of data, compressed into a tight package, followed by a single word in a language that the translation system flagged as Korean, a human Earth language. The word was Junbi Dwemyeon. Vithari looked at Piri. What does it mean? Piri had already run it through the translation database. It means, when you are ready, she said. Vithari stared at the screen for a long time. The signal pulsed steadily, every 30 seconds, patient and unwavering. He reached out and touched the console, as if he could feel the hand of whoever had sent it. "What is in the data package?" he asked. Piri opened it. Inside were coordinates, a single point in space, far beyond Council borders, in a region of the galaxy that no Council species had ever explored. There was nothing else. No message, no demands, no conditions, just a location and a word. When you are ready. Vithari called an emergency session of the Council. It was the 14th emergency session in 2 months, and the representatives arrived looking exhausted, angry, and defeated. The Branathi ambassador had a bandage on his arm from where a piece of his own ship's hull had struck him during the conflict. The Tohari ambassador's wings were folded so tightly they looked like they might break. The Rethki ambassador sat in his usual seat with his hands folded and his 6 eyes fixed on the empty human chair at the center of the chamber. Vithari stood at the central platform and played the signal for everyone to hear. The clean, steady pulse filled the chamber. Then the word, spoken in a language none of them understood, translated on the display screen above. When you are ready. The chamber erupted in argument, as it always did now. The Branathi ambassador demanded that they ignore it. "It is a trap," he growled. "The humans left us to suffer. They are watching us burn, and now they want to gloat." The Tohari ambassador shook her head. If they wanted us to burn, they would not have sent coordinates. They would have sent nothing. "Maybe it is a test," the Rethki ambassador said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. He had been the calmest voice in the Council through the entire crisis, and they had slowly learned to listen to him. "Maybe they want to see if we have learned anything." "Learned what?" the Branathi demanded. The Rethki looked at him with all 6 eyes. "How to ask for help." That sentence landed in the chamber like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread outward in silence, because asking for help was something that the Council had never done, not once in its 800-year history. The Council gave orders, it made demands, it issued proclamations. It did not ask. Asking meant admitting weakness. and weakness was something that no species on the council could afford to show. But the humans had never seen it that way. The Rethki ambassador understood that now, after reading Soha's report and Jian's medical guides and Dawan's maintenance logs. The humans asked for help all the time. They asked each other. They asked strangers. They asked anyone who would listen. And when nobody could help, they helped themselves. And then they turned around and helped everyone else too. It was not weakness. It was the opposite of weakness. It took more courage to say, "I need you," than to say, "I don't need anyone." The debate lasted for 2 days. It was the longest continuous session in council history. Representatives argued, shouted, walked out, came back, and argued some more. Vithari presided over all of it, barely eating, barely sleeping, holding the chamber together by sheer will. In the end, they voted, closer than Vithari would have liked. But the motion passed. The council would send a single ship to the coordinates in the signal. Not a warship, not a fleet. One ship, unarmed, carrying a message. Vithari insisted on writing the message himself. He sat alone in his office for 6 hours, drafting and redrafting, crossing out words and writing new ones. He thought about Tejo. He thought about the wooden bird still sitting on his desk. He thought about a young woman named Soha who had seen the truth and been punished for it. He thought about Jian, who had healed people she had no obligation to heal. He thought about Dawan, who had fixed things he had no obligation to fix. He thought about Yuna, who had protected people who never once said thank you. The message he wrote was not long. It was not grand or eloquent. It was simple, because Vithari had finally learned that the most important things usually were. It read, "We were wrong. We did not see you when you were here. We see you now. We are not ready, but we are willing to try. If you will have us, we would like to learn how to walk beside you instead of behind you. The council asks, humbly and with open hands, for your help." The ship launched the next morning. It was a small Rethki vessel, chosen because the Rethki had been the first to understand what the humans meant to the council. The pilot was a volunteer, a young Rethki officer who had been treated by Dr. Jian when he was a child. He had never forgotten the human woman with the gentle hands who had sat beside his bed and told him stories in broken Rethki until he fell asleep. The ship crossed the council border and entered unknown space. It flew for 3 days, following the coordinates exactly, and when it arrived at the destination, the pilot looked through his viewport and stopped breathing. Human ships of every size and shape, arranged in a vast formation that stretched across the darkness like a city made of light. They were not hiding. They were not running. They were waiting. They had been waiting all along. A single human vessel broke from the formation and approached the Rethki ship. It was small, a shuttle, nothing more. It docked gently against the Rethki vessel's airlock, and the door opened. Captain Yuna stepped through. She looked the same as she always had, calm, steady, her dark hair tied back, her uniform clean and pressed. She looked at the young Rethki pilot, and she saw the scar on his arm, the one Jiun had stitched closed 15 years ago. She smiled. It was a small smile, tired around the edges, but real. "We got your message," she said. The pilot's eyes filled with tears, all 6 of them. "Are you coming back?" he asked. Then she looked past him, through the viewport, toward the distant stars of council space, where a galaxy was struggling to hold itself together. "We never left," she said quietly. "We just stopped carrying you. There is a difference." She reached out and placed her hand on the pilot's shoulder. It was a human gesture, simple and warm, and the pilot felt something he had not felt in 73 days. He felt safe. "But yes," Yuna said, "if you are ready to walk, we will walk with you." The pilot nodded. He could not speak. He did not need to. Yuna turned and sent a single message back to the human fleet. One word, in Korean, the same language the first signal had been sent in. "Shijakaja." It meant, let us begin. And across the dark and wounded galaxy, for the first time in a very long time, the stars did not feel so cold. It took exactly 41 days for the Galactic Council to begin tearing itself apart. The fighting started small. A trade dispute between the Brenathi and the Tohari over fuel rights in the Kessler Corridor. It was the kind of disagreement that had come up before, many times over the centuries, and each time it had been quietly resolved through negotiation and compromise. But this time there was no one to negotiate. The human diplomatic team that had traditionally mediated trade conflicts was gone, and without them, the two species found that they had no idea how to talk to each other without shouting. The Brenathi were a proud species. They were massive, stone-skinned, and slow to anger but impossible to stop once they were. They believed in strength and direct action. When they had a problem, they solved it with force, and they did not understand why anyone would do it differently. The Tohari were the opposite. They were small, winged, and quick. They believed in patience and subtle strategy. They preferred to talk for weeks rather than fight for an hour. They saw the Brenathi as brutes. The Brenathi saw the Tohari as cowards. These opinions were as old as the council itself, and they had been kept in check for decades by a very simple mechanism. The humans had sat between them. Not physically, not always, but in every major negotiation between the Brenathi and the Tohari, for the last 30 years, there had been a human in the room. Someone calm, someone patient, someone who could listen to both sides without taking one. Ambassador Tejo had done this more times than he could count. He would sit between the two delegations, his small frame dwarfed by the massive Brenathi on one side and the fluttering Tohari on the other. And he would talk. He would rephrase angry words into softer ones. He would find the one point that both sides agreed on and build outward from there. He would stay in the room for hours, for days if needed, until the deal was done. Nobody had ever asked him to do this. It was not part of his official duties. He did it because he saw two species that could not communicate without help, and he could not sit by and do nothing. That was the human way. See a problem, fix the problem. Do not wait to be asked. Now Tejo was gone, and the Brenathi and Tohari were alone in a room together, and nobody was there to translate their anger into something that could be survived. The trade dispute escalated into a blockade. The Brenathi positioned warships along the Kessler Corridor and refused to let Tohari merchant vessels pass. The Tohari responded by cutting off scientific data sharing agreements that the Brenathi depended on for their mining operations. Within a week, both species had recalled their ambassadors from each other's homeworlds. Councillor Vithari called an emergency session to mediate. Vithari was a skilled politician, but he was not a mediator. He did not have the patience for it. He tried to impose a solution from above, ordering both species to stand down, and both species told him, in very different ways, to mind his own business. The Rethki ambassador watched all of this from his seat with growing horror. He had been reviewing the old files that the human diplomatic team had left behind. Thousands of documents, meeting notes, conflict assessments, cultural analysis reports, communication guides. The humans had studied every species in the council with an attention to detail that was almost frightening. They had mapped out every old grudge, every cultural sensitivity, every potential flashpoint. And they had used that knowledge not to manipulate, but to prevent conflict before it started. One document in particular haunted the Rethki ambassador. It was written by a young human analyst named Soha, 7 years before the withdrawal. The document was titled Structural Fragility Assessment of the Galactic Council, and it was 200 pages long. Soha had spent 3 years writing it. She had interviewed members of every species. She had studied the Council's history going back 800 years, and her conclusion was devastating. The Council, Soha wrote, was not a stable institution. It was a collection of species held together not by shared values or mutual trust, but by convenience and by the quiet labor of external stabilizers. Remove the stabilizers, and the council would collapse within one standard year. The stabilizers she was referring to were the humans. Soha had submitted the document through official channels. It had been reviewed by a junior council clerk, marked as speculative and alarmist, and filed in an archive that nobody ever checked. Soha had been reassigned to a supply route on the far rim shortly after. That was how she ended up delivering food to forgotten colonies instead of advising the council on how to survive. The Rethki ambassador read Soha's report 3 times. Then he stood up in the council chamber and read key sections of it out loud to every representative in the room. He did not shout. He did not accuse. He simply read the words of a young human woman who had seen the future with perfect clarity and had been ignored. When he finished, the chamber was quiet. But it was not the good kind of quiet. It was the quiet of people who know they have made a terrible mistake and do not know how to fix it. The next crisis came 2 days later. A plague broke out on a Rethki colony world. It was a respiratory disease that spread fast and hit hard, especially among the young and the elderly. Under normal circumstances, Dr. Ji-yoon's medical protocols would have contained it within days. Her team had developed rapid response procedures for exactly this kind of outbreak. They had stockpiled antivirals. They had trained local health workers. They had even run practice drills twice a year. But Jian was gone. Her team was gone. The antivirals were gone. The local health workers tried to follow the procedures she had left behind, but without her guidance, they made mistakes. The disease spread to 3 neighboring settlements before anyone could stop it. 400 people died in the first week. The Rethki ambassador stood before the council and held up the medical guide that Jian had written. 200 pages of careful, detailed instructions for handling medical emergencies across multiple species. He held it up so everyone could see it. This book, he said, his voice cracking, was sitting on a desk for weeks, collecting dust, while my people died. Nobody could meet his eyes. The council was falling apart, and everyone knew it. Species that had cooperated for centuries were turning on each other. Old alliances were breaking. Old hatreds were surfacing. The Branathi blockade of the Kessir Corridor was choking trade for 5 systems. The plague on the Rethki colony was spreading. The pirate raids were getting worse. And underneath all of it was a truth that nobody wanted to say out loud. They had needed the humans. They had always needed the humans. And they had treated them like they were nothing. Vithari sat alone in his office that night and stared at his desk. On the desk was a small object that Teho had left behind. It was a wooden carving of a bird, handmade, clearly from Earth. Vithari had found it in a drawer after the humans left, and had kept it without knowing why. Now he picked it up and turned it over in his hands. It was light and smooth, worn from years of handling. Teho must have carried it with him for a long time. Vithari thought about all the times Teho had sat in that small chair in the council chamber. All the times he had spoken calmly and clearly about threats that nobody wanted to hear about. All the times he had offered help that nobody wanted to accept. All the times he had been dismissed, overlooked, interrupted, and ignored. And still he had stayed. Year after year he had stayed. Until the day he didn't. Vithari set the wooden bird down on his desk and pressed his hands against his eyes. His shoulders shook, just once, and then he was still. Outside his window, the stars burned cold and distant, and the council drifted in the dark like a ship without a compass, surrounded by storms it had refused to see coming. The food ran out on Ketha Station first. It was a small colony on the edge of Rethki space, home to about 10,000 people. Most of them were miners and their families. They dug rare minerals out of the frozen ground and shipped them to the inner systems, in exchange for grain, medicine, and clean water filters. It was a simple life, a hard life, but it worked, because every 30 days a supply ship came through the relay lane and delivered everything the colony needed to survive. A supply ship did not come. The station administrator, a tired Rethke woman named Goltha, sent a message to the council logistics office asking about the delay. She received an automated reply saying that her request had been logged and would be processed in the order it was received. She waited 2 days and sent another message. This time, she received no reply at all. On the 8th day without supplies, Goltha opened the station's reserve stores. There was enough food for maybe 12 days if she rationed it carefully. She cut portions in half and told everyone to stay calm. Help was coming. It had to be coming. But help was not coming, because the ship that had been delivering supplies to Ketha Station for the last 11 years was a human vessel. It was run by a crew of 6, led by a quiet woman named Soha, who never raised her voice and always arrived exactly on schedule. Soha had memorized the needs of every colony on her route. She knew that Ketha Station needed extra water filters in the dry season. She knew that the children on mining platforms preferred sweet grain over the standard ration bars. She knew that old Goltha had a bad knee and could not climb the loading ramps, so Soha always had her crew carry the supplies directly to the storage bay. Soha was gone now. Her route was unassigned. When the council logistics office finally looked into Goltha's request, they discovered something that made them go very quiet. The supply route to Ketha Station was not listed in any council shipping schedule. It had never been officially assigned. It had never been funded by the council budget. It had never appeared in any annual report or resource allocation meeting. Soha had been running that route on her own, using her own fuel, carrying supplies that she had purchased with funds from a human aid program that nobody on the council had ever heard of. This discovery led to a larger investigation, and the results of that investigation shook the council to its core. It turned out that humans had been quietly subsidizing an enormous portion of the council's basic infrastructure for decades, not through official channels, not through treaties or trade agreements, but through thousands of small, invisible acts of support that nobody had ever bothered to track. Human engineers had repaired and upgraded communication relays across 9 star systems without submitting maintenance requests or billing the council. Human medical teams had developed treatments for diseases that affected species they had never even met, and distributed those treatments for free through networks that ran entirely on human funding. Human logistics crews had been filling gaps in the council supply chain for years, rerouting their own ships to cover routes that council planners had overlooked or underfunded. Lieutenant Dowen's name appeared in the investigation more than anyone else. He had been the chief engineer at Station 12 for 7 years, and during that time, he had quietly rerouted power from the station's secondary systems to boost the shields on 3 nearby civilian platforms that the council had classified as low priority. He had done this without permission and without pay. When the investigation team reviewed his maintenance logs, they found that he had also designed and installed a water recycling system for a Tohari refugee camp on the station's lower levels. The system was not in any official blueprint. Dowen had built it using spare parts and his own time. The investigation also found records of Dr. Jian's work. She had treated more than 4,000 non-human patients during her posting at Station 12. She had trained 16 local medical workers in human surgical techniques. She had written a 200-page medical guide translated into 3 council languages, covering emergency procedures for species whose biology she had learned entirely on her own. The guide was still sitting on the desk of the medical bay. Nobody had opened it yet. And then there was the food. The Council's agricultural reports showed that 12 colony systems had been receiving supplementary food shipments for the past 15 years. The shipments were small enough to avoid triggering any audit flags, but large enough to prevent famine in communities that the Council's own distribution system had failed to reach. The source of these shipments was listed in the records as external aid, unclassified. The investigation traced the shipments back to a human charitable organization based on Earth called the Nuri Foundation. It had been founded by a retired human officer named Minho, who had served in Council space for 30 years before going home. Minho had seen the gaps in the Council's supply chain during his service. He had filed reports about it. Nobody had listened. So when he retired, he started a foundation and filled the gaps himself. The Nuri Foundation had been feeding 12 colony systems for 15 years, and not a single Council official had ever known about it. When the investigation report was presented to the full Council, the chamber was silent for a long time. Councillor Vithari read through it twice. He looked at the numbers. He looked at the names. He looked at the long, detailed list of everything the humans had done without being asked, without being paid, and without being thanked. The Rethki ambassador spoke first. "We are not facing a military crisis," he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were wet. "We are facing a humanitarian one. The humans were not just our soldiers, they were our caretakers, and we did not even see them." The Tohari ambassador lowered her head. "How did we not know?" she whispered. "Because we did not want to know," the Rethki replied. "It was easier to believe we were strong on our own. It was easier to believe the humans were just filling chairs. We looked past them, because looking at them would have meant admitting that we needed them, and our pride would not allow that." Vithari set down the report. His hands were trembling slightly, though he tried to hide it. He thought about Tejo standing in this very chamber, saying those 3 words, "We wish you well." At the time, Vithari had thought it sounded cold, distant. Now he understood that it was the kindest thing Tejo could have said, because the truth would have been much harder to hear. The truth was that the Council had been living on borrowed time, borrowed peace, borrowed food, borrowed medicine, borrowed safety, all of it given freely by a species that the Council had treated as minor, insignificant, and disposable. Ketha Station ran out of food 4 days after the investigation report was published. Gultha sent one final message to the Council before the communication relay failed. It said, "The children are hungry. Where are the humans?" Nobody had an answer. The Council scrambled to organize emergency supply runs, but their ships were slow and their logistics were a mess. Routes that Soha had memorized by heart took Council planners weeks to even chart. Supply crates sat in warehouses because nobody knew which colonies needed what. 3 more stations reported critical shortages before the first Council ship even launched. And somewhere far away, on a small farm on Earth, a retired officer named Minho sat on his porch and looked up at the stars. He had heard the news. He had read the reports. He felt the weight of it in his chest, heavy and familiar. He had spent 30 years trying to tell the Council what would happen if nobody listened. Nobody had listened. Minho closed his eyes and let the night air wash over him. The stars were bright tonight. Somewhere out there, 12 colony systems were going hungry. Somewhere out there, a tired Rethki woman was rationing the last of her food and asking where the humans had gone. Minho whispered into the dark, "We were right there. You just never looked." The first attack came on the 5th day after the humans left. A convoy of 12 cargo ships was moving through the outer relay when a pirate fleet dropped out of dark space and hit them from 3 sides. The cargo ships had no weapons. They had no shields. They had nothing but their cargo holds full of grain and medical supplies meant for the colonies on the far rim. The pirates tore them apart in less than 20 minutes. The distress signal reached Council Station 12, but nobody answered it. The defense console that Commander Jian's team used to monitor the relay lanes was dark. The automated alert system that Lieutenant Dowen had built and maintained for 7 years was offline. The rapid response squadron that Captain Yuna had trained and led was gone. There was nobody left to respond. Counselor Vithari received the report 3 hours later. He read it in his private chamber, his long fingers wrapped around a cup of heated nectar. 12 ships destroyed, 86 crew members dead, cargo worth 3 million standard units lost. The pirates had vanished back into dark space before anyone even knew what had happened. Vithari set down his cup and called an emergency session of the council. The chamber was full within the hour. Every species sent their senior representative. The Rethki came with their 6 eyes wide and nervous. The Tahari came with their wings folded tight against their backs. The Branathi came with their stone-like faces showing nothing at all. They sat in their curved seats and they looked at each other, and for the first time in a very long time, nobody spoke first. Vithari stood at the central platform. He was tall and thin, with silver-blue skin and a voice that could fill any room without effort. He had led the council for 22 years. He had guided them through trade disputes and border conflicts and 3 minor wars. He had always believed that the council was strong because of its unity, its traditions, its ancient wisdom. He had never once believed that the council was strong because of the humans. "We have a situation," Vithari said. His voice was calm, but something underneath it was not. "The outer relay has been hit. Our defense grid in that sector is not responding. I need someone to explain to me why." Silence. The Rethki ambassador raised one of his 4 hands. "The defense grid in the outer relay was maintained by the human team stationed at Post 9, he said quietly. "Post 9 has been empty for 5 days. Vithari stared at him. "Empty? What do you mean, empty?" "The humans left, Counselor, all of them. Did you not receive Ambassador Tejo's statement?" Vithari had received it. He had read it, nodded once, and filed it away. He had assumed it was some kind of political gesture, a negotiation tactic. Humans did that sort of thing. They made dramatic statements, and then came back to the table asking for better terms. He had expected Tejo to return within a week, looking embarrassed and ready to bargain. But Tejo had not come back. None of them had come back. "Send a message to Earth Command," Vithari ordered. "Tell them their withdrawal is causing instability in Council space, and that we expect their immediate return to their assigned posts." The communications officer, a young Tohari with bright orange wings, worked at her console for several minutes. Then she looked up with an expression that Vithari had never seen on her face before. It was fear. "Counselor," she said, "the human communication relays have been deactivated. All of them. I cannot reach Earth Command. I cannot reach any human vessel or station. Their entire network in Council space is gone." The chamber erupted. Representatives shouted over each other. The Branathi ambassador slammed his heavy fist on his desk and demanded military action. The Tohari ambassador fluttered her wings and called for calm. The Rethki ambassador sat quietly and said nothing at all, because he was the only one in the room who had actually read the reports that the humans had been filing for years. He knew what was coming. Over the next 3 days, things got worse. Much worse. The pirate fleets had been watching. They had been waiting in the dark spaces between stars, held back for decades by human patrol ships and human-designed defense grids. The humans had not just been guarding the major trade routes. They had been running a network of early warning systems, hidden sensor arrays, and rapid response teams that covered almost every major lane in Council space. Nobody had asked them to do this. They had done it on their own, because they saw the danger, and they could not stand by and do nothing. Now that network was gone, and the pirates knew it. 3 more convoys were hit in the following week. A mining colony on the far rim sent out a distress call, saying armed ships were in orbit and demanding tribute. A fuel station near the Branathi border was raided and stripped bare. A passenger liner carrying 400 civilians was boarded and robbed. The Council sent its own military ships to respond, but they were slow. They were disorganized. They had not run a real combat operation in years, because the humans had always handled it. Their weapon systems were outdated. Their tactics were from textbooks written before the humans had even joined the Council. They arrived at the passenger liners 16 hours after the pirates had already left. Vithari called another emergency session, and then another, and then another. Each one was louder and angrier than the last. Species blamed each other. Old grudges that had been buried for decades suddenly surfaced. The Branathi accused the Tohari of underfunding the military. The Tohari accused the Rethki of hoarding resources. The Rethki accused everyone of ignoring the humans when they had tried to warn them that exactly this would happen. They filed reports, the Rethki ambassador said one afternoon, his voice shaking with frustration. Hundreds of reports, every year. They told us the pirate threat was growing. They told us the defense grid needed upgrades. They told us the supply routes were vulnerable. And every year, this council voted to table those reports and move on to other business. Nobody argued with him, because he was right. Vithari sat in his chair and looked at the empty seat where Teho used to sit. It was a small seat. The humans had never asked for a bigger one. They had never asked for better quarters, or more funding, or a louder voice in council debates. They had simply done the work. Day after day, year after year, they had kept the lights on, and the lanes safe, and the food flowing, and the council had treated them like servants. Not even servants. Servants were at least acknowledged. The humans had been invisible. Vithari thought about the last time he had spoken to Teho. It was at a reception 3 months ago. Teho had approached him with a datapad full of supply chain projections, showing that several colony systems were dangerously dependent on human-managed logistics. Vithari had listened for about 30 seconds, then excused himself to speak with the Branathi trade minister about wine imports. Wine imports. He closed his eyes and pressed his long fingers against his temples. The chamber was loud around him. Representatives were shouting and pointing fingers and demanding solutions that nobody had. The defense grid was failing. The supply routes were collapsing. The pirates were growing bolder by the day. And somewhere out there, beyond the reach of council communications, the humans were silent. Vithari opened his eyes and looked at Teho's empty chair one more time. The small, uncomfortable chair that nobody had ever thought to replace. He wondered if it was too late to start listening. The message arrived at exactly midnight, ship time. Captain Yuna was sitting alone in her quarters, staring at the stars through the narrow window, when her console blinked twice, and then went still. She knew what it meant before she even opened it. She had been waiting for this order for 3 years. She just never believed it would actually come. The message was short, only 14 words. Withdraw all personnel. Leave nothing behind. Do not explain. Earth command, final. Yuna sat there for a long time. She read it again, then once more. Her hands did not shake. Her breathing did not change. She had trained herself a long time ago to keep her feelings locked deep inside her chest, where nobody could see them. But tonight, something heavy pressed against her ribs, and she could not name it. She stood up slowly and walked to the bridge of the starship Hanul. The hallways were quiet. Most of the crew were asleep. The lights along the floor glowed soft blue, the way they always did during the night cycle. She passed the mess hall, where someone had left a half-empty cup of tea on the counter. She passed the medical bay where Dr. Jiun kept the lights on, because she said the dark made her patients nervous. She passed the small room near engineering, where Lieutenant Dowen slept with his boots still on, because he never trusted the peace enough to fully rest. Yuna reached the bridge and sat down in the captain's chair. She opened a channel to every human ship, station, and outpost in Council space. There were 47 of them. 47 positions spread across 12 star systems. Humans were everywhere in Council territory. They ran the defense grids, they managed food supply routes, they trained medical teams, they translated between species who had hated each other for centuries. They did the work that nobody else wanted to do, and they did it without complaint. Yuna pressed the transmit button. This is Captain Yuna of the Hanuel. Authorization code Jindo 7. All human personnel are ordered to begin immediate withdrawal from Council space. You have 48 hours to pack, shut down your stations, and return to Rally Point. Do not explain your departure to Council officials. Do not leave behind any human technology. Do not say goodbye. She released the button and sat back. The bridge was silent. Outside the window, a Council trading station floated in the distance, its lights blinking like a small city in the void. Yuna had protected that station for 6 years. She knew every docking port, every weak spot in its shield grid, every corridor where the ventilation was bad. She had bled for that station once, during the fringe raids, when pirates had cut through the outer hull, and she had held the breach with nothing but a welding torch and her bare hands. None of them had ever thanked her for it. By morning, the word had spread through the human ranks. Nobody questioned the order. That was the thing about humans that the Council never understood. They argued with each other constantly. They debated and disagreed and shouted in meetings. But when the order came, the real order, the one that mattered, they moved like water. Fast, quiet, and impossible to stop. Dowen was the first to finish packing. He had never owned much. A spare uniform, a toolkit, a photograph of his mother, standing in a rice field back on Earth. He sealed his bag and walked through the engineering section one last time, running his hand along the reactor housing he had repaired 11 times. He whispered something to the machine that nobody heard, and then he left. Jiun took longer. She had patients in the medical bay of Station 12, a young Vithari with a broken spine, a Rethki child with a lung infection that only human antibiotics could treat. She administered the last doses, wrote detailed instructions in the Council's medical language, and placed them on the desk where the next doctor would sit. She did not know if anyone would read them. She did not know if anyone would come. She stood in the doorway of the medical bay and looked at the Rethki child sleeping in the blue light. The child's mother was curled up in the chair beside the bed, her 4 arms wrapped around herself. Jiun wanted to say something. She wanted to promise that everything would be fine. But the order said no goodbyes. So she turned off her console, picked up her bag, and walked away. Ambassador Taeho had the hardest job. He was the last human in the Council chamber. He had served there for 9 years. 9 years of sitting in a chair that was too small, in a room that was too cold, surrounded by species who looked at him like he was something stuck to the bottom of their shoe. He had smiled through insults. He had drafted peace agreements that other species took credit for. He had stayed calm when Councillor Vithari called humanity a young and reckless species in front of the entire assembly. Taeho stood at his desk and looked around the chamber one final time. The great curved walls, the floating light panels, the rows of seats arranged in a circle so that every species could face every other species. It was supposed to represent equality. Taeho had always thought it looked more like an arena. He picked up his datapad and walked to the central platform. A few council members were already arriving for the morning session. They looked at him with mild curiosity. Taeho was not scheduled to speak today. He cleared his throat. I will be brief, he said. His voice was calm and steady. Effective immediately, all human representatives are withdrawing from the Galactic Council. All human military personnel, engineers, medical staff, and support teams will depart Council space within 48 hours. The chamber went silent. Councillor Vithari's mouth opened and then closed. The Rethki ambassador blinked all 6 of his eyes. Tejo looked at them. He looked at every face in that room. He memorized them, not out of love, not out of hate, but because he wanted to remember this exact moment for the rest of his life. We wish you well, he said. Then he turned and walked out of the chamber. His footsteps echoed on the stone floor. Nobody called after him. Nobody asked him to stay. Nobody said, thank you. The doors closed behind him with a soft hiss, and Ambassador Tejo kept walking until he reached the docking port, where the last human shuttle was waiting. He climbed aboard without looking back. Within 48 hours, every human was gone. The defense grids went dark. The supply routes went unmanned. The medical stations went quiet. 47 positions across 12 star systems emptied in 2 days. The Council did not notice for almost a week, and by then, it was already too late.